If I can get the little. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today with the UC Berkeley High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. Again, my name is Jason Muñiz, and I am the director of the Berkeley History Social Science Project, which is one part of the larger High School Ethnic Studies Initiative here at UC Berkeley. And I wanted to go ahead and get us started today. But before we get too far, I want to take a moment to do a brief land acknowledgement. We don't have a whole lot of time to sort of delve deep as we'd like to into a land acknowledgement today, but just know that this is part of larger work that we do for our Indigenous community. UC Berkeley, our institution, sits on Huchin, which is the ancestral land of the Chichenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda, who have resided on this land since time immemorial. As the first federal land grant university in what is now California, UC Berkeley benefited from the taking of Ohlone ancestral land during the early years of statehood. Today, the Muwekma Ohlone and the Confederated Villages of Lishan, among others, continue to organize for federal recognition, revive cultural practices, reintroduce models of sustainable land stewardship, and protect sacred locations like the West Berkeley Shell Mound. Our organization commits to supporting these Indigenous-led efforts, reinforcing accurate and healing instruction, and correcting our past work that perpetuates harm and misunderstanding. So again, we like for those not to be so cursory in a box that we check off. Due to time, I can't go in deep into our land acknowledgement as I'd like to, but I'm glad we were able to sit with this information today. All right, so I would like for us to do a little bit of a brief check-in with our time to get started. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to do a little bit of a waterfall protocol, which is something if you've never done. I'm going to ask a question and then ask folks to type their response to the questions in the chat. And when I say waterfall, we'll all hit enter and we'll share all our answers simultaneously so we can share our response and see what everyone's thinking at the same time. Our prompts for today are these. In the chat, please share your name, pronouns, and background of ethnic studies. That'd be great. But also, I'm curious to know if you could please share your opinion on what you consider to be the most difficult part about teaching ethnic studies. There's a lot of different ways you can answer that question, but I'm very curious to see how the folks in this collective consider a challenge in ethnic studies instruction. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and type those into chat. If you want to hold and say until I say waterfall, we'll see all our answers at the same time. Yeah, we'll give you about a minute and a half to think on that response and type that right in. All right, folks, let's go ahead and hit response or hit enter. Let's hit our waterfall and let's share who we are and some of the challenges that we see for ethnic studies. All right. Eric says, difficult thing ninth graders to feel the content, not just learn it. That's interesting. Here a little bit of ethnic studies is. That's great. Eileen, not enough time or student engagement and buy-in for sure. Centering the history of your community. Thanks, Kuka. Amount of time, I think we all sort of feel that sometimes we're working with ethnic studies courses for sure. I'm gonna skip around a little bit. Keisha, most difficult part would be doing all the cultures justice. Heard, absolutely. Um, Jenny, thank you for adding this. The most difficult part is not being such a downer. I think we're gonna speak to that hopefully a little bit today. All right. And thank you all for making a contribution and sharing your thoughts about, well, first your identity in a very basic way, but certainly what are some of the things you consider most difficult about teaching ethnic studies? All right, so before we get started, I wanted to spend a couple moments doing a little bit of house cleaning and sharing some information about our program and who we are and what we're doing here today for those of us who have never joined one of our sessions. I'd like to share a little bit about the UC Berkeley High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. So we're a collective of three different departments on UC Berkeley campus. Um, that's quite right. My role here is as director of one of those units, which is the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project, but we're also joined by folks with the American Culture Center and the Department of Ethnic Studies here at UC Berkeley. And our work here is really to use the university resources that we have at our hands to support high school ethnic studies educators, but really ethnic studies educators from K-12 whenever possible, to support with content and pedagogies that can be used in their classroom. Of course, we want to provide and expand an opportunity for you to expand your professional networks and talk to other ethnic studies educators. But ultimately, we wanted today provide access to some of those resources and some of the scholars that we are in conversation with a lot of times. So we love to sort of share what we have and who we have access to and the knowledge that we are surrounded by here with all of you who are doing the work of developing ethnic studies courses or refining your existing ethnic studies courses that are out there. Right. Um, One way that we're doing that, by the way, is, and I'm hoping that you can get some feedback on this, is we are actually working on a hub of ethnic studies resources. So tons of lesson material, readings, scholarly works, videos, a ton of resources are available. And what we are now calling the UC Berkeley Ethnic Studies or High School Ethnic Studies Initiative Resource Hub. And that hub, I'm going to share with you a link. There's a bit.ly that's on the screen. Of course, you can use that. But I'd love to share with you that information on in the chat as well. And what you're going to see is it's really right now a resource that is still in beta mode, and we're hoping that folks can sort of look around and play around with that resource. There is a form that also I want to share with you where you can go ahead and give us feedback on what works for this website, what doesn't work. But you'll see it's a ton of different things that hopefully you as educators can find particularly useful. We love for folks who have great resources to contribute to it as well. So that form that I sent in second is another resource that you're going to have access to review the site, give us feedback, but also share some other resources that you might have. So if you are developing your course or looking to refine your course and you're looking for some of the some resources to better what you're working on, that's a library of stuff that we have made available through our program, the High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. And again, it's a living document sort of resource. So anytime that you have something great that you'd like to share, we'd like to share it to the broader Bay Area community as well. So feel free to take advantage of that, share what you want. We'd like to see this be something that grows and we can contribute to and continue to use as we're doing the work going forward. So hopefully you'll get some value out of that. And I'll repost that link and some other information around that hub in just a little bit as well. All right, so don't get too lost in looking at the hub. I know it's awesome, but we're here today to speak to some wonderful guests on a specific topic. I'd like to first give you a little bit of idea about the protocol that we're going to follow in our conversation today. Right. So in a moment, we're going to be joined by Brian Villa and Dashia. Oh, Dashia, I forgot your last name. Dashia Wright. And Brian and Dashia are going to be joining us in a fireside chat conversation, roughly for about 45 minutes. I have a number of questions that I've prepared for them, and I'll also be taking your questions. Brian and Dashia are going to be speaking with me, but the rest of the participants during this session will be remaining muted. And let me give you some details about that. Questions and comments that you might have, we of course want you to give us as much feedback as possible. So feel free to add those into the chat. I've carved out some specific time at the last third of our conversation time to respond to all the questions and comments that you're having. So feel free to add them and I'll answer them in the order that they're received. Now, the other part of our time together is after we've had our conversation with Brian and Dashia, I'm hoping that we can have an educator discussion that'll take place right after. And there we're going to sort of process the discussion in breakout sessions with some of the educators who want to sort of talk about what's been going on. But if you wanted to not process and talk about the conversation or the topic that we're having around hope and healing and ethnic studies, We definitely invite you to stay in the main room and not go to a breakout, because there's where we're going to do a little bit of networking with some of the educators here. So as you can see right now, we have 24 folks, a few more are going to be added, and we like to think that this is going to be a professional network that you as an ethnic studies educator can take advantage of. So folks you haven't met before, please, at that point, you want to introduce yourselves, share a little bit about what you're doing and some of the challenges that you're confronting, and you never know who might be in the space that will be able to support you or give you some insight that might be valuable. So again, we'll have our conversation. Time for Q&A. Watch in the chat, and then we'll Brittany will ask or we'll share our appreciations for our speakers, and then we'll move over to some educator discussions. Okay. So with that said, let me share a little bit about our guests. First, we're going to be introducing Brian Villa, and who is a second year Doctor of Public Health student at UC Berkeley. And I've asked Brian to be here today with us because he has a lot of great experiences working with YPAR. And I'll give Brian and our other guest, Deja, a little bit of an opportunity to discuss what YPAR is and how it's relevant to our question. Also joining Brian today is Dashia Wright, who is currently a student studying psychology at University of Kentucky, but also was a student sorry, uh, there we go, a student of Brian's while he was in the classroom, and can share a little bit of insight about what it was like to do some YPAR projects. And with that, I wanted to share a little bit about what our session focus question is going to be. So the reason I asked folks to join us today is a lot of the feedback that I get when I go into do professional development at a lot of different school sites is folks who are learning about what ethnic studies is for the first time are sort of taken aback by what some of the content is, and how often and how detailed we have conversations with our students around things like systems of oppression and all sorts of injustice that sort of come up very organically as we're studying ethnic studies. And it becomes a little bit more of a pain point for students studying ethnic studies, because we make a very concerted effort in high school ethnic studies to tie the instruction around a very personal, very lived experiences. So talking about systems of oppression and some difficult topics, and then making those hit home and be very personal, it's a place where there's a little bit of harm that comes out of those conversations. For myself, I would teach ethnic studies in Oakland, and I had students who would tell me all the time, Mr. Muñiz, we love your class, but we leave your class just upset and sort of down and depressed just based on some of the things that you're sharing with us and the things that we're talking about in our classroom. And I had to sit with that and think about how could I make space for my students to have hope and healing from all the sort of toxic and sort of damaging and potentially harmful things that I'm giving them to sit with and think about, that are very personal. So just by affirmative, like a hand show of hands, a thumbs up for those of you who are in chat, and I'm going to stop the share right now so I can see you all. How many folks here who are ethnic studies educators have had a similar experience where you can just tell the content that you're providing to your students has sort of sit with them in a way that makes them feel a way, and it's difficult for them to sort of understand or deal with because it's intense? Yeah, a few of us there. Thumbs up. So one of the ways, and again, this is as I'm not going to profess to be amazing expert. When I had that problem with my students, I went to other teachers and said, "Well, how do you account for this? What do you do?" And one of the ways that was suggested to me by other scholars was to think about ways to be very intentional about how we make a space for hope and healing, and what we do to give our students a sense of agency that they can do something about some of the very problematic and difficult things that they're learning about. And one way to do that is by taking action, by doing some sort of civic action project. And so that's why I've decided to bring to all of you today educators and scholars who can talk about what it looks like to take action and to gain a little bit of agency over the problems and difficult things that we learn about ethnic studies courses. So that's why we have Daisha and Brian today. And I would love if you two folks would unmute yourselves and say hello to the folks in the space. We'll start off with we'll let y'all who decide who wants to go first, but I'll pin you all as folks who are going to be on our screen. And yeah, say hello and feel free to introduce yourselves. I have a bunch of questions, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself and describe your background, perhaps with working with you.
Great. I can go ahead and start us off. Hello, everyone. Great to be in space with you today. My name is Brian, and I'm currently a second year in the Doctor of Public Health program at UC Berkeley. And my research focuses on youth participatory action research, or YPAR, which we'll talk about a little later. And I've worked with youth in various capacities. I spent 6 years as a community health manager at the Rise Youth Center in the city of Richmond, where I actually met Dashia when she was in high school. And I was also trained by the Pinoy Panay Educational Partnerships at SF State. That's headed by Professor Allison Tintianco Cumbales, where I had the opportunity to teach high school Asian American ethnic studies course in San Francisco. So I'll pass it over to Dashia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dashia Wright. I'm currently a counseling psychology student at the UK. I'm getting my master's. I'm from the Bay Area. I went to De Anza High School in Richmond, if anyone knows. And yeah, back when I was in high school, I did a YPAR project where Brian was my preceptor. And since then, I've been able to stay in contact with Brian, and also I was able to work as a staff research assistant at UC Berkeley and Dr. Emily Ozer's YPAR lab. So I was able to kind of have my full circle moment where I went back to help out other folks that were doing YPAR projects. I was in the classroom, I was super active, and I love doing that. And I'm really excited to be here and glad to be in community with all of y'all.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dashia, for being here with us. I appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom of your experiences here. And just kind of just diving right into the question at hand. There's a lot of challenges that come with teaching ethnic studies, and some of the things that we share with students can be really difficult and can sit with them in a way that is uncomfortable, because a lot of times it may be the first time that at school they've been asked to confront some of the thoughts and ideas that sort of come up in ethnic studies courses. So I'm hoping that you can share how YPAR can make space for that healing that needs to be sort of intentionally done. But before we get too far, would Brian and Dashia, would you mind sort of sharing out with the folks here, in your words, in your own words, what is YPAR?
Great. So youth participatory action research, or YPAR, I like to think of it as an approach. It really is an iterative cycle of research and action that really centers youth voice, social justice, and equity. And throughout the process, young people are really engaged and hold power and leadership, and they decide on various topics and issues and questions that they want to investigate that are directly impacting their schools and communities. And so through YPAR, they're trained up in various research skills, quantitative and qualitative research methods by adult partners who serve as supportive guides or facilitators. And so the students then conduct systematic inquiry, and they collect data, they analyze the data, and then they develop action plans and recommendations informed by that data in efforts to improve their schools and communities.
I can see some of the ways that some brains are sort of spinning, like, oh, you're using data to sort of like support some actions in the classroom and taking civic action. I guess we'll get into some of the details in a little bit, but before we go there, Brian, would you mind sharing how you came to engage with WEC?
Yeah, so I was trained in YPAR through the organizations I mentioned earlier, like PEP and RISE, and I've been able to support YPAR projects in various classroom and youth center spaces. And currently, as part of my research work, I am supporting partners and educators in various districts with YPAR technical assistance. So I support by providing workshops on various phases of the YPAR process. And currently, as part of my dissertation work, creating this interactive online data dashboard that I hope to release sometime soon that would help share out findings from YPAR projects across California, across different districts and classes and initiatives. But it was actually at Rise where I first met Dashia. So several years ago, Rise conducted a listening campaign, which was an inquiry into understanding the experiences of trauma, coping, violence, and healing of young people of color in Richmond, and really speaking to young people about what their needs and priorities are. And so after presenting the data from the listening campaign back to students, and I want to note that that often doesn't happen, in our classrooms and in our districts, students get surveyed over and over again, but they don't necessarily see the results of those findings and surveys. And so when Rise actually presented the surveys or the results back to young people, the young people actually had their own questions that they wanted to ask. They wanted to conduct their own research. And so, they affirmed that we were asking really important questions, but that they wanted to ask their own questions as well. And so back in 2015, I contributed to the development of a YPAR public health internship, where Dashia was actually an intern when she was a junior in high school. And so I'll pass it on to Dashia to kind of share how she got engaged in YPAR.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So how I got engaged, like Brian mentioned, I was still in high school at the time, and we had like different academies in school. So I was in the health academy. They had these like guests that would come in weekly, and they teach us like about like equity and like what public health was. And they basically bribed us and was like, hey, if you do good in this class, you can get a summer internship. And one thing about young Dashia, she was very money motivated. And so I was like, oh yes, I'll do anything for an internship. So I paid attention, and then they were like, okay, you're going to work at this youth center. And I was like, a youth center? Because at the time, I always knew I wanted to be a therapist. So I wanted to be at a health center so I could work with a therapist. So I was like, a youth center? What? And I get there, I meet Brian, and he's like, okay, so we're going to be conducting research. And at that moment, he had definitely lost me because I was like, research? Like, what are we doing? But I ended up growing to really, really love YPAR and love the research process. And I can talk a little bit more later, like super specifics of like how I got to loving it. But for our project, we were able to focus on gender and sexual-based violence within Richmond, California. And a key thing about that was we were kind of able to like select the topic ourselves based on things that we were seeing happen within our community to ourselves, to our peers. And through that, we were able to collect 130 surveys. We did 10 interviews. At that time, it was the summer, but a lot of us were still in summer school. So we would go to our summer school and be like, hey, everyone, fill out our survey. It was such an like interactive process. And from then I remember like the data saying, because we wanted to kind of understand how young folks were experiencing gender and sexual based violence, like what their experience looked like, but also the supports that they needed. And so I remember when we were going through the data, like it was, I believe, like 80% of male identifying students felt safe. And I remember seeing that number and I was like, Brian, this is really high. Like, this is kind of the opposite of what our project is about. And he was like, yeah, why don't we compare it to those who identify as females? And when we saw the difference, it was like 80% for those who identified as male and then 40% for those who identified as female. And then, so just seeing that difference, I was like, oh, wow, like this is what we were looking for. And then also too, we had like a question on like, do y'all like, how comfortable and confident were people with knowing the term like gender-based violence? And that's where we saw, I think was like 70% of students weren't even like familiar with that term. And that's kind of how we realized like there was just a huge normalization of violence within our community. And just like having that data and having that knowledge really kind of informed the way we moved going forward. So it informed the interview questions we asked, it informed our action plan. And for our action plan, we were able to host focus groups because we really wanted to to create like this culture of education, and we want to have these open conversations. And we're also able to share our findings with like our school board advisors, the Rise Youth Center staff. And I was even fortunate enough to speak at a conference back when I was in high school. So it brought a lot of like great opportunities for me, but also a great way to really spread the knowledge and the things that we were learning throughout the process.
Well, that's great. I'm really interested, and I'll hold off on the question about the impact that it had on you, and sort of the ways that it sort of shifted your thinking for a little bit. But I'm definitely interested to hear a bit more about that, because that sounds like an amazing experience. Although I do want to ask Brian, it seems like there's a few different approaches to doing youth organizing, to sort of encouraging students to take action. Our program, we work with some other folks who do some integrated action civics projects, and that's not the same thing as YPAR. So I'm just interested to know, like, how does YPAR sort of align or differ from other forms of youth participation? What can you share about, like, what it is about this particular resource or approach that that makes it unique and something that teachers should consider using?
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share a quick slide. Can everyone see my screen? So I just want to name that YPAR is just one form of youth participation, and there are different forms. And I think that depending on the context, some approaches might make sense more than others, depending on time, depending on context and resources. And so there are different forms of youth participation, including adult-led research and evaluation, youth database inquiry, Y-plan, kind of more youth-centered design and youth-led evaluation. But the key distinguishing elements of YPAR is that the youth are really deciding at the start the questions and design and the methods and the directions that they want to pursue with adult support, of course. And another piece is that it does involve systematic research or evidence generation. So that's a key piece, is that the young people are actually going out there and collecting data. They're conducting surveys or interviews and focus groups, and really looking at the data they collect and analyzing and drawing out key themes, and connecting concepts that they're learning in their classes. So I know in some elective courses that we provide technical assistance for, they talk about social justice concepts. And so in the data analysis process in YPAR, that's where you start to see students really start to identify where some of these concepts are popping up in what students are reporting and what students are sharing in some of these interviews and focus groups.
So this is a great model. It makes me think, though, that the center, that one slide, actually, can you bring that back up for a second? I just wanted to sort of speak to sort of specific elements. Just coming at it from a educator's perspective, and knowing what it's like to plan a class with students, and plan what the interactions with your students are going to be. I'm looking at that top center box where we're talking about the youth deciding on questions, designing methods and actions. How much is it youth centered, where they're doing like sort of the construction of the project, and how much guidance are the teachers and YPAR projects actually providing? So, like, what's the structure like in terms of actually doing this with your students?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really big tension in YPAR. In the YPAR approach, it really is challenging traditional notions of power, especially between youth and adults. And I think as facilitators, as educators who are leading YPAR projects with students, it's important to be self-reflective around those power dynamics, because oftentimes, in spaces, in education spaces, there are, decision makers that are increasing, youth participation in various, decision-making processes. but not really paying attention to the power structures that are still maintained in those spaces, and really thinking about how young people are actually being authentically engaged and how to share power and how to have young people step into their power, is really important to really work through. And sometimes I think, as educators, they may like steer young people towards a certain direction. But I think that starting off with just kind of an open discussion about what young people are experiencing, I think that's one of the big value add to YPAR, is that, it really acknowledges that young people bring in such rich experiences and knowledge to the table, and that they're navigating through these systems every single day, and they have something to say. And I think at first just listening, authentically listening, and really trying to understand, well, what is most pressing for students right now in this moment? Because issues are very dynamic. There's a lot of issues in the school systems, and it's going to take a huge movement. But what is something that's calling to students right now? And I think Dashia can speak to this, is that the young people really have to feel connected to that issue, that question, and feel like they have ownership over it, or else they may lose engagement throughout the process. And so I'll pass it over to Dashia to kind of speak to that.
Yeah, Deja, did you find that to be the case? Like you're having like sort of a say in what the study was about, was a little bit more connective? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, it was, we were super involved. And so like we literally handled everything. So for when I did YPAR, I was with two other students, and we came up with everything from our topic, our research question. A great method that Brian did was like allowing us to use sticky notes. So like literally we would write every thought that came to mind. So the way we came up with our topic, Brian was just like, go ahead and write on a sticky note things that you're seeing happening around you, like issues. And so we would write a bunch of stuff. And after we finished that, like after a few minutes, I remember it was a nice experience too. We had music playing, like it was very relaxing and it felt freeing. But after that, we kind of categorized each sticky note to like different topics. And so for us, some things that came up that got us to land on gender and sexual based violence, we talked about like cyberbullying, catcalling, slut shaming. So when we had all those things, we're like, this overall theme of gender and sexual based violence came up. So like where Brian kind of stepped in is sometimes helping with like certain language. So for example, we didn't naturally talk and say gender and sexual based violence, but we said, hey, this is what we want our topic to be. And he's like, oh, how do you feel about these words? And we're like, yeah, that's good. With our research question, we literally, again, with the sticky notes, we wrote a bunch of questions we had on the sticky notes, and Brian would say like, hey, maybe this question's a little too specific, but that can be a survey question. And so we would do it like that. And then when it was broad enough to be our research question, we kind of like chose that. But like each step of the way, it was really our words. And I think that's the best role of like the adult facilitator, is kind of either putting things in words that the students may not necessarily say themselves, but like to make it more succinct, or like encouraging them like, okay, this might not be it, but if we keep going, we'll get there. It's kind of like that thing.
No, that's great. So a couple things. First, for my educators who are here in the space, I please invite you to put your questions in the chat. I definitely going to make space for the questions that have already been asked, and whatever ones that you're coming up with. So as ideas are coming up to you, feel free just to put those on there, and we'll make as much time for those as we really can. I want to kind of talk about the project. Brian, I know you've had some experience at this specific site and perhaps others, but maybe Deja, perhaps maybe even more for you. Can you speak to the impact that doing this sort of work had on the students who were doing the work and on the school itself? Did you see any sort of change, or was there sort of a degree of agency that was gained by doing some of this work?
Yeah, most definitely. So like there's a lot of literature out there too that supports this, that says like doing YPAR, like it helps develop leadership skills and like academic skills and kind of like public speaking. And I know for me and my personal experience, I definitely really grew with like my leadership abilities, and then just like my public speaking and also my confidence. I feel like with YPAR you have to talk a lot to like folks that have more power than you, and like folks that will probably just disrespect disregard you in the first place. So like being confident and talking about issues that I'm seeing within my community, but also offering different solutions and like not being afraid to kind of like say like, hey, I'm here in this space. I know what I'm talking about. And like, you'll respect me. I think that definitely helps me grow a lot. And like, I can definitely still see those strengths in me today and like the way that I show up in my classes and my program. So it's really like it pours so much into you at an early stage, and you can still see it like see the effects of it later on for sure. Oh, and also too, just like academic wise and career wise, like I've gotten a lot of opportunities for YPAR. I always like to joke and say that YPAR is what got me into college because I was not like a super involved student. My resume was like, okay, going into college, I worked at Wingstop. That was like my only extracurricular. And then I did YPAR and they're like, yeah, we want you. So I love to joke about that. But also too, like YPAR was able during my gap year, I was able to like secure a full-time job still working in the YPAR field, or like if I have like essays and stuff, I'll write about my YPAR experience because it's so unique. And so it impacts you in so many different ways that you wouldn't even think about.
Brian, similar question. What's been the impact and how's it landed in terms of like changing any things at the sites that you've brought it to?
Yeah, I think Deja kind of mentioned the impact on kind of the individual level of the student. And I will also add that Deja was actually able to publish a journal article, an academic journal article, when she was a junior in high school. And so all the young people who were engaged in that particular project were able to be published authors. And so I just want to, just give kudos to Deja for doing that. But I think, aside from like the individual level positive impacts and outcomes, I think we also have to recognize that YPAR can also lead to positive changes on the school environment and systems level. And so in some of the work I've done with schools and classes, we provide technical assistance. And one of the school sites we worked with, the students in one class were interested in investigating student voice and power and school policy. And they were actually able to survey close to half their school student population. And that's a lot. Sometimes that's more than what, administrators get in some of their surveys. But what they found was that a majority of the students had identified that they felt like they didn't have any power at their school and that they were rarely asked by adult staff to provide any input on school policy or classroom curriculum. And so we help the students really analyze the data and really think through and have conversations about, what does it actually mean for you to feel like you have power at school? And what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And what's the purpose? And they just wanted to feel seen. They wanted to feel like they belong at their school. And so we were able to help them prepare a presentation to their school admin. And as a result, the administration actually created more opportunities for students to sit in on decision-making processes. And the students were actually able to host more student-led campus-wide events. So in this example, the students were actively engaging in their school environments to increase sense of belonging, to increase spaces for student voice. And aside from kind of policy, YPAR can really inform changes to programs, practices, not just for teachers in the classroom, but for service staff too, in counseling departments, even things around academic and career supports or college readiness.
So at this point I'm curious to know a little bit about like the process, the logistics, like the actual like a way that this sort of goes forward. So it's probably like a more than sort of name with like a lot of details, but I guess maybe let's make some space to sort of name some key considerations when you're doing the planning or the conducting or even assessing of YPAR projects. So do you think you'd be able to speak to what some of those things are?
Yeah, I think when organizing your YPAR curriculum, YPAR is an approach and it can be adapted in different ways. There are certain kind of values that drive YPAR and certain phases that are pretty common across different approaches. And I think for me, when I facilitate a YPAR project or curriculum, I really have to assess where my students are at and what are some of the adaptations that I need to make and where I should focus more of my time on. Maybe it's on data collection, and we're not training our students to be like expert researchers, but maybe it's more around like, how do I create more engaging ways to analyze data? And so, for example, one way one workshop that we do is kind of having different questions on posters around the room and have them kind of like mark off kind of like an interactive survey. And so that they're already starting to see how data kind of organizes itself. So for example, a question is like, are you a dog, cat person, neither or both? And then we'll have like, from a scale from 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? So also exposing them to different ways that surveys can really display and show data. And also thinking about, maybe more time might be spent developing skills like public speaking, or really thinking through more of the concepts about the issues that they're studying. And so one thing that I always make sure is that before kind of proceeding to the next phase, whether it's issue identification or data collection, that I provide adequate scaffolding to be able for students to engage in that way. And students are going to engage in different ways in YPAR. Some might be more interested in data collection, and some might be more interested in putting the presentation together. But I think it's kind of thinking about how this class is collaboratively working, and then supporting the students throughout. And that also includes ensuring that there are spaces that are safe for folks to be able to share, how they feel about certain issues. I think that's a really key piece, is, integrating some of these other approaches like trauma-informed care or healing-centered engagement into YPAR is really important. And I'll kind of pass it over to Deja to maybe speak through the different phases of YPAR.
Yeah, so the first part of Y part is like Brian mentioned, like a lot of relationship building. So like sometimes Brian will let us come and we just eat snacks and talk. And I think that's really important to kind of like just make sure, like Brian said, making sure you have this space where like the youth feel comfortable to speak and share their thoughts. And also a lot of times people can get a little embarrassed or like nervous to be like, hey, I think this, like making sure that environment is comfortable to do that. And then I think a lot of what we did, again, ours took place like in a youth center over the summer. So we didn't have like a lot of this background that I think y'all already provide y'all students in ethnic studies. So like we spent a large amount of time like watching documentaries or watching TED Talks, reading things and like discussing that. And so that's kind of like an advantage y'all have as ethnic studies teachers. Like y'all are already getting your students like familiar with so many like different injustices and things that are happening within the world. So we focused on that. And then I think from there, also a lot of it is really reflective. So like, what am I seeing around me? What are things that are happening to me? And then, like I mentioned, we then transitioned over to like coming up with our topic and our research questions with the whole sticky note activity. And then once we had our research questions found, we kind of made like our mock survey or like our part one of our survey where we had questions, and then we were able to test it out on other students within our youth centers. So we literally went out and we're like, hey, if I asked you to do this right now, like which questions sound confusing or which questions do you not like? How do you feel with how long this survey is? Would you fill this out? Would you answer it honestly? So like we used our peers to also make sure that the survey was like better and we're able to improve it that way. And then after we went through that phase, we were able to finally like hand out all our surveys to students, have them take it. We then analyzed our survey, our data. And so Brian literally just put everything into like different pie charts. And then we looked over each one and we talked about like the thoughts that came up, what it meant to us, what we thought we were going to see versus what we did see. And I think that portion of like going over what the data truly means is super important, because I think sometimes we can just see numbers and we're like, oh, okay, like cool, that's a high number. But I think really discussing like, what does this mean, and like what do these numbers actually stand for? And then after we analyze the data, we then kind of were able to create our interview questions. And the interviews were my favorite part. I'm still a qualitative girl to this day, so I loved the interviews and being able to really hear people's narratives and their stories. And then again, making sure that our space was comfortable enough for them to do that. And then after that was the action portion, which is where we were able to present all our findings and share it with different people. And the action looks different for everyone. For us, we really wanted to share a lot, but for some folks, it might be like putting up different posters around or hosting an event, like Brian mentioned before. So the action always looks different, but that's kind of what our process looked like.
No, that's great, and I like the fact that like the action was certainly like a named as like, all right, so we're taking an action, we're doing something with the information that we like learned through this process. You know, for all of us who have done ethnic studies instruction, it's sort of confounds like the banking model of sort of like we're just learning things just to learn it as opposed to doing something with it. So I appreciate that. Again, as someone who worked with students and did ethnic studies instruction with kiddos and thinking about what it was to sort of bring action to my students. One thing that was a bit of a challenge for me, and I think I might kind of put this one to Brian a little bit, um, was when the students would take on work at the end of all this learning and these projects we would do, and then came time to sort of assess like so how does assessment sort of look in project-based learning to your mind that's sort of centered like around what YPAR does?
Yeah, I think for assessment, it has to be ongoing throughout the YPAR process because, our students' lives are so dynamic. And even within our school ecosystem, there's so many things that can come up. And sometimes in YPAR, you really just have to stop and it's not business as usual. And there's issues that are happening in the real world that need to be addressed. And so I think, constantly engaging in, checking in with students, seeing where they're at, seeing, how they're feeling about the process and understanding, maybe what shifts you might need to make. I know in one of the projects I facilitated, it took so long to kind of get through the data collection piece, but that was because of a lot of timing challenges and events that were happening. And so I kind of lost them in that phase of the YPAR process. Um, but there's something that always happens when the students actually see the data. And I think that speaks to the power of data and the fact that they collected it and they talked to these students and they heard these narratives is really powerful because there's something that clicks, and I don't know, it's like kind of hard. Sometimes it's really hard for engagement, but up to that point. But then when the students actually start like creating action plans that are informed by all the work that they do, um, it really starts to um, it really starts to light a flame and a passion. And I think in that case, as far as evaluation, I think it's also important to make sure that the concepts that we're teaching students, like, issues around or concepts like intersectionality or things like that are carried throughout the YPAR process so that it's not kind of just at the beginning, but that it's constantly being, returned to. So even in their action plans and recommendations, how can some of those concepts be integrated, like, equity? How do we make sure that our action plan is actually speaking to the, population that we're hoping to serve? How is it leaving certain groups out? How is it, what are some of the unintended consequences? So making sure that as a facilitator that I'm constantly reflecting on the process itself, but the products and outcomes of the students are also kind of aligned with some of the values, the YPAR values or ethnic studies values.
I'm seeing that we're actually coming across a little bit of a time thing, so I want to make sure that we get just a couple more questions, and I'm going to turn to the teacher questions. So again, if there's other educators who want to put other questions in the chat, feel free to do that. We'll be jumping to those in just a moment. Just very briefly, what are some resources that teachers can access if they want to integrate YPAR into the curriculum that they're designing or have already designed?
Great. So our work with Professor Emily Ozer, we've developed a YPAR hub and with resources and in that website. The resources include lesson plans, different lesson plans for the various phases of YPAR. And I can add it to the chat, but folks can browse through that. And in the YPAR hub, we also have links to other resources on YPAR. And we also, the YPAR hub was actually created in partnership with community organizations that are doing YPAR work in various districts. And so some of the lesson plans are, coming from their initiatives, their programming, and we're also updating some of the lesson plan and including some new ones, some new workshops. During the pandemic, we had to shift everything to kind of an online format. So that option is also still available where, at the start of the pandemic, teachers really wanted student voice, projects that really engaged student voice, but wanted it more in kind of like a condensed module format. And so we were able to adapt that based on what the needs were. And there's also a contact page if you have any questions about the YPAR hub or the lesson plans that we can answer.
Great, and thank you for sharing those links, and I'm absolutely sure that many of the teachers in the space will have some questions once they sort of see and get a hold of some of the resources that they'll be looking through. I guess I want to give of my questions anyway the last word to Dashia at this point, because you've been in a classroom where YPAR was presented, and it's I'm very interested to know for you, like, if you wanted to speak to the impact that it had on you personally, like the change, because again, going back to the original question, we were talking about how sometimes ethnic studies courses and some of the content that our students are being asked to sort of sit with can be a challenge. It can hurt to sort of really sit there and wrap your head around and do work around. How did the experience of taking action sort of impact you, and what do you think it meant to be involved in a project like this?
Yeah, for me, I think that, like we've mentioned, like a lot of the stuff that you learn in ethnic studies and when talking about issues like social justice, it can be super heavy. And so I think the thing that YPAR gives is just a lot of hope in like that feeling of really tapping into your power. I think a lot of times when we hear these issues, we're like, these are so big, like, and a lot of times we think like, oh, I myself cannot change the world. But I think also it allows students to be like, kind of open to the idea of like impacting their communities. So it's like, I can change my community. And if not my community, I can change my school. If not my school, I can change my classroom. Like it's finding a way to tap into that power in some way that still feels just possible. Cause I think a lot of times we can get discouraged. And so I think it gives that like glimpse of like, I can make these changes, I can take action, and like there's some things that I can do. And I think also YPAR kind of gives that gift of like community, because it's like, okay, I'm looking at the things around me. I'm like acknowledging these collective experiences that we're having. We're collectively working towards a goal of like making things better. And it also just gives you a lot of knowledge, which sometimes knowledge can be a little bit draining. But like Brian mentioned before, like the terms like intersectionality and like a lot of these theories that I learned at an early age, which I wouldn't have known before, I think sometimes having language to the experiences and the thoughts you're having can be really empowering as well.
Thank you for that. All right, so I'd like to turn to our teacher-led questions, and we have a few there. Greg, I know you posted a couple of them here. I'm going to do the third one and then come back around after we've got some of the other folks. So hope you don't mind. That's the process I want to go with here. But that last question sort of resonated with me as well, so I wanted to ask that one. He said he's really interested in how you'd suggest YPAR work, quote, in a mandatory class assignment. just mainly thoughts around the fact that as he's hearing Deja talk about a YPAR and an after school sort of affinity group, that may be different from doing it in an assigned class. So folks that have to do a project versus the ones who are sort of opting into doing that work. What's the difference to your mind, Deja, having done it your way? And then also, Brian, how do you respond to the challenges that come from doing sort of action projects as a mandatory action project, which is a little bit different?
I'll say for me, from one doing it in like an after school setting and then going back to like working and supporting those who are doing it within a school setting, I feel like it's kind of it's a mix. Half of it is like so the perks of like doing it outside of school is like we were able to get paid. We're connected to like a resource being our youth center. So like there was tons of resources there. Like we had access to a computer lab, to different faculty. So like there's its own experience within that. Within the school settings, I think one bribing students with grades, well not bribing them, but it's like okay, when students realize like, oh, my grade depends on this, they kind of care a little bit more. um I've seen a lot of like they'll either split students up into groups or kind of sometimes they'll do one big class. But I think the main thing is as long as like the students are actively engaged and like they actually care about the topic, they care about like what it is that you're focusing on, especially as it relates to the school environment, I think it does help them engage a lot more. But Brian can speak more on that.
Great. Yeah, I think there's always a tension, especially when integrating YPAR in a classroom setting, because I think there are folks that would argue that you shouldn't assign a grade to a process like this that really is about transforming systems and structures of oppression and really promoting health and well-being and equity for students. Um, so I think in my experience, some of the ways I kind of look at assessing YPAR in a classroom is um, level of engagement. I think communication, ensuring that if students are having issues or challenges on particular parts, that they're able to express that and we're able to kind of think of an alternative. I really try and assess my students at the beginning to kind of see what they're interested in, what are some of the strengths and where are some of the places they want to improve. And so I look at, improvement. And I like to say, I meet students where they're at, but we don't stay there, right? We make a plan and we make a goal to really figure out, where do they want to be at the end? And, I think like when students present, there's a lot of hope, and, people feel really good. And I think that one thing that adult facilitators really need to support at the end is actually the follow through with adults who are, witnessing these presentations. Because oftentimes, the presentation ends, but there's no take up of what the students are suggesting. So I think that's just one piece that kind of comes to mind at the end of presentations. As adult allies, how do we continue to support students in seeing their action plans come to fruition? But kind of going back to the assessment, yeah, I think having benchmarks around, how students are feeling throughout the process will kind of give me a general sense of how they kind of move throughout the process. And so I can see the change and shifts. And I think reflection questions are also really important. I think with Deja's cohort, I had them do just some general reflection questions about how they were feeling, what are their thoughts. Even if they felt like nothing was going anywhere, I think I looked at that as them actually being engaged, and knowing that, and engagement looks different, right? I think that's another thing too, is people show up in different ways. And so, yeah, I think understanding where the students are coming from at the beginning and tracking to see how they've changed, both emotionally, socially, academically, is really important to take it in a holistic lens.
Um, Katie's asked a technical question, and I'm curious about this one as well. Katie says that their classes are about 33 to 35 students. What's an ideal size for a group working together on a YPAR research question? Or does it vary? Like, what's the thoughts on like logistics in terms of like size of groups and sort of the working together?
I've seen some educators kind of have the whole class move together. And I've seen educators break them out into groups and phases. And so they're kind of informing each group and they kind of present to each other and they're also teaching each other about what they're learning and, kind of pass it on to the next group. I think it really depends on, what your timeline is. I think sometimes it's, if you have a shorter timeline, I think group work is helpful. Um, but sometimes, having the groups kind of move together, but have like specific assignments can also help. I don't think there's a set number. I think it really depends on, where your students are at, and it might vary from class to class. I've also seen some really interesting formats where all of their classes are doing the same YPAR project topic and they kind of feed into each other's classes. Like, one class will do surveys, another class will do interviews, and then they'll kind of share their findings with each other.
Awesome. All right, Mr. Foley has asked, or has it stated, I find that students cannot comprehend what their research turns up. And then I see that they have huge deficiencies in background knowledge, which is the key ingredient in reading comprehension. This makes me think that we should spend more time with direct instruction that conveys world and word knowledge. How does that sit with you in terms of what you've experienced in doing some of this work with students?
Sorry, I'm just rereading the question. Yeah, I think with that, I'm also very mindful to not just throw out jargon words and really think about how to create accessible curriculum, whether it's you know thinking how I can adapt to English language learners and activities that might better engage English language learners. I know when we go into technical assistance workshops, we do work with a lot of classes that have English language learners. And so we try to have things translated or have someone who speaks in different languages, um, making sure that folks are able to engage in a way that they feel they can. And I think where it gets a little tricky, right, is like there's so many different research terms, and I I sometimes am very intentional about what I cover based on kind of what I'm feeling the class is most interested in. And maybe we don't get into the nitty gritty on like, data analysis and thematic analysis, but I think I think that I also don't want to put limiting frames on students. And so I try things out and I kind of ask them like, oh, is it okay if we try this out? What don't you understand? How can we work through this together? Um, and and just yeah, like I think being really iterative, YPAR is very iterative. It's a cycle. And so I think when there are issues, it's important to embrace them and really think about, well, what were some of the root causes of those issues and how can we as a community kind of move forward and have like that healthy struggle. I think that's another important piece in YPAR is really engaging in some of those challenges. Um, Other than that, like adaptations to make sure it's like grade appropriate, age appropriate, and like accessible to different abilities uh, and kind of learning modalities, whether it's like, oh, let's do more art-based work and integrate more, analysis in that way, I think could also benefit some of these other like competencies.
Speaking of challenges, one last question from our teachers. when students collect data and see a trend and a solution, does the teacher slash admin get on board? Does the admin ever push back? Do students give up? What's been your experience with the responses to some of the work?
I've seen like in one of the districts that we've helped, I think a lot of times the teacher, because the teacher is helping the students create like facilitate the project, the teachers are usually on board. But I've seen like it being to where there is admin pushback. And I think that's a lot of times when like the adult facilitator, like that's when it's great for them to kind of like not necessarily step in, but like use that adult power to kind of like filter a little bit of the hits and be like, you know what, like I'm going to talk to you first to preface like, hey, my students are coming in, they're going to talk about this, and still letting the students like lead. But I think that's definitely when it's nice to have the adults lean in and also like hold those spaces for students to like kind of unpack what it feels like to not necessarily make the solutions that they want to make, and like how can we pivot and move forward. But yeah, and I'll pass it to Ryan.
Yeah, I think engaging admin at the very beginning, oftentimes admin is kind of included at the end
Mhm.
where the presentation happens, and like there's no room for dialogue after that, but engaging some of those decision makers at the start is really helpful. And I always think about what it looks like and sounds like and feels like to be in authentic relationship with students. In one of the YPAR projects I supported, young people identified that they don't trust adults, but at the same time, they also identified that they need adults and they need adults to be there for them, to listen without judgment, to help advocate for them in spaces and structures that have historically silenced, oppressed, or problematized them even. And so when I think about what's needed in YPAR in terms of adults, I think it really is about building trust and relationships and really showing up for the students, actively listening and staying as proximate as you can to their needs and priorities. Um, and thinking about how to create that safe space, and make sure that adults are actually ready to receive the data and evidence. A lot of the young people I engage with say that adults need to do their own work, and we have our own issues to sort through. And so, how can we kind of be um, really reflective about showing up for young people and letting them know that no matter what happens, that they're still going to be held with love and understanding.
I agree, and I appreciate your saying that part. So before I move on, and talk a little bit about some of the next moves that we have in mind. I'm gonna give a moment for you all to sort of talk a little bit about the YPAR hub and share some things that educators who want to use this resource might want to know. So this is the YPAR Hub website address, and I invite you all to take a look at that, play with that. There's of course ways to communicate with our guests and follow up and ask what their experience has been. This doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the conversation there. I want to take a moment to thank our guests, Brian and Dacia. I appreciate your joining us today. It's been great giving your hearing what your thoughts and your experiences have been, and thank you for all the great work that you've done and your willingness to share with us. Appreciate that.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
So before we move forward, and again, I'm going to make sure that we are going to share resources to communicate with our guests again in the future. So I'll be following up with everyone. There's going to be a video of our session as well that I'll make sure that we share out.
I could
Um,
also add my email to.
yeah, if you wouldn't mind dropping that into chat, that'd be great. Thank you so much. All right. And I did want to make a little bit of space for us to process some of the information. But before we do that, I just wanted to share just briefly a couple of things about our high school ethnic studies initiative. The way that we typically do this work is we'll learn about and we'll be in conversation with our educators on one Tuesday, and then a week from that day, so on the 19th, we sort of plan next steps regarding what we've learned today. You're all cordially invited to sort of be part of that conversation. Think about how might it be to sort of share some of these resources, apply them in your classrooms. We'll have a conversation, a practical one at the same time next week. You're all invited to be there. It's not mandatory, of course, but we'd love for you to be there and sort of share your thoughts. And I did also want to mention again that hub is available for you to use, share, contribute to. We love when teachers who have been putting great resources into action sort of share what they've done and sort of give those out to other educators broadly to sort of play with, think about, consider using with their students and their classrooms and their communities. So by all means, use that hub, play with it, share it with other educators. It's meant for people to sort of make use out of. The last thing I want to mention before we sort of break out into a little bit of a discussion part is this is our time today with Brian and Dashia as part of a scholar conversation series, and we have some other events that are coming up in the next year. In January, we rescheduled an event that we were supposed to have in November, where we're going to be talking with a filmmaker who did a documentary about the warrior women at Wounded Knee, sort of sharing about how to honor Native activists in ethnic studies classrooms. So that's happening in January. In March, we actually have already just set up a conversation with some scholars here at UC Berkeley about teaching Pacific Islander pedagogies, and here in the Bay Area, that's a specific community that doesn't often get a lot of attention in textbooks and instruction, but we want to make space for that, especially as we're making ethnic studies courses that are serving our communities and what they authentically look like. We'll also be doing another conversation about how do we address challenges to ethnic studies, which for many of us is something that resonates pretty deeply. And also, for those of us who are doing work in ethnic studies that aren't necessarily in history, social science alignment, we want to make sure that that's also spoken to as well. And we're going to be spending some time talking about art and literature. Those of us who are in ethnic studies classes, those of us who are doing ELA ethnic studies courses might find that one particularly interesting. And again, ethnic studies is interdisciplinary, so we hope that you all know that this can look any number of ways, not just with a history, social science lens. The filmmaker that I want to mention, her name is Beth Castle. We'll be talking with Beth on Tuesday, January the 30th. There's a link at the bottom there that I can also share with you all regarding just signing up and registering for that event as well. So now we kind of got that in the books. I wanted to take a moment to share with you all this. And again, links to all that stuff is going to be made available. So if I went too fast or you missed it or you have questions, of course, we'll be happy to share those with you going forward. But I'm hoping we could do one of two things now. With the time we have left, and it's about like 10 minutes or so, I'm going to open up some breakout rooms that are optional for folks to join. And the option is really around this prompt that I'm hoping that we can have a discussion around. I wanted to hear from you all who've just sat with this conversation about YPAR. What role does student action have in ethnic studies courses you teach or intend to teach? And what are some of the assets and obstacles that you've experienced when including these projects? So again, I'm going to put that prompt into our chat to make sure that folks can sort of sit with that one. Oops, let me actually put it into our chat. Right. So again, what role does student action have in ethnic studies courses that you currently teach or intend to teach? And what are some assets or obstacles that come when including those sort of projects in the work that you're doing? So we go ahead and place that in the chat so folks can see. And I'm going to open up again just some breakout rooms. If folks want to have that conversation around that, we welcome you to sort of break out and have a discussion around that. Otherwise, I love the fact that we get some ethnic studies educators together. So if you have conversations that you'd like to sort of get into and develop some sort of connections with other folks who are doing the same work as you, we absolutely invite you to go ahead and do that. I'll be here to sort of preside over those conversations and make introductions if that's the sort of thing that we want to have. Besides that, I'm having trouble making breakout rooms. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording today and let you know that I thank you all for being here. And does anybody have any questions or interesting things to bring up before we move on to our next session, the next part of the session?